Hi, hello everyone. Hi, Chelsea. Let me add you. So, okay, awesome. Chelsea should be joining us.
Hey,
Hi,
hello.
how are you?
I'm good. I always get nervous about this part of
Yeah,
whether the internet.
me
Hi.
too. Is it going to work? Is the internet working?
That's right. So nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. And I mean, we never really met like through like camera. We
Right.
chatted a lot on Instagram and shared a lot of reflections. But thank you so much. Welcome everyone. So welcome to this really exciting live. I'm really excited to welcome Chelsea with us. So before we start, I will introduce Ninti very quickly, and then we will dive through. I received so much questions about all this maternal myth. You can tell that it creates some very uncomfortable thoughts out there. So I can't wait to share more with you all. So I'm the co-founder of Ninti. My name is Fatoumata Ali. We are two co-founders at Ninti, Olga and myself. We built Ninti with a very simple idea. It's from our hormonal cycles until menopause. As people with uteruses, we kind of go through a lot of things on different kind of journeys, and very often we lack support and we lack information. So we built a digital reproductive platform that you can find by clicking in the link in our bio, where you can book sessions with practitioners, health experts on sexual and reproductive health, but you can also connect with our community and join conversations like this. The entire idea is really how do we make sure that we are able to create a support system where we can lean onto when going through fertility treatment, stillbirth. As you know, people with uteruses and women, we go through so much. So how do we make sure that we also break the taboos on all those subjects? And we are going to dive right into them with the maternal instinct. And Chelsea, thank you so much because we never met. We shared several messages when I read your essay on the New York Times that I found when I read the title, I was like, is she serious? All the beliefs, everything that I was thought was kind of, I was just like, I need to read this essay. And when reading it, I just felt very called into having conversations with you because it was the first time that I was reading someone actually expressing a very strong thesis around maternal instinct.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
I will let you introduce yourself, and then I have questions, and feel free to ask your questions in the comments, and this will be also a replay, so you will be able to catch up if you're missing the live.
and Fatimata, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear
Okay.
you okay. Yeah, you can.
So
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me. It's been so nice talking with you just by IG messages, and now to have the opportunity to talk, it's really a pleasure. So I'm a journalist. I'm a health and science journalist. That's my background. And in 2015, after my first son was born, I really was struggling with my own transition to motherhood, and found a lot of comfort in the research on the maternal brain specifically. And so I started looking at that work just to cope myself. And eventually that became this book. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was really a story that was missing from prenatal education. And that helped me a lot. And I thought could help a lot of other people, not only with our individual experiences of parenthood, but really with like the broader social framework, the relationship between parenthood and society, and how that needs to change. And so this book, Mother Brain, How Neuroscience is Rewriting the Story of Parenthood, was published in September. And if people want to learn more about it or about me, they can find my website at motherbrainbook.com.
awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you, Fiona. Welcome. Feel free to share your thoughts as well. So in your book, you talk about this evolution of motherhood and how it started and the different phases. And you mentioned the archetypes. And one that really caught me was this modern Christian one and the identity of Virgin Mary being eclipsed by the glory of maternal love. And you also mentioned the sacredness of home and how it was rising with capitalism. So can you share with us what it meant as mothers, like to be a mother, and how motherhood evolved in different centuries through timelines, and what were the tipping points of motherhood on those different journeys?
It's such a big question, right? But as I was looking at this research, I think one thing that I kept running up against was this question of why the maternal brain or the parental brain science hasn't become like more a part of our cultural conversation around parenthood. And I started looking at, well, maybe it's because we already have a story that the obstacle is the story we're already telling, which is the one about maternal instinct. And so I started looking at like how maternal instinct became part of scientific theory, like how we really became ingrained in our understanding of what it means to become a parent. And I think your question is such a fascinating one because, it's a long history. That evolution of motherhood is a long history, but there are, I think, some important points to look at in terms of our like Western, particularly concept of what motherhood is. And I specifically looked at like, so the Virgin Mary image is one that has always felt very precious to me. I was raised Catholic, and a lot of the strongest women in my life, really respected that image a lot. But as I became a mother, especially, I started thinking about like, is it the whole story? Like, is it? What if like Mary had been given a chance to tell her own story? What would it have looked like then? And so one thing that I really found so interesting in researching the history of maternal instinct as science was this idea that really we had these like religious notions of what a mother and what a woman is that were kind of embedded in evolutionary theory and then carried forward through the 20th century in really interesting ways. So Charles Darwin, we have to look at like the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century was a time when women were really fighting for more rights and more literally rights under the law and a bigger place in public society. And as evolution was becoming more accepted and more prominent, we saw this like doubling down really on like conservative ideas of womanhood and so we saw these ideas of what was known then as true womanhood, that the idea that like a woman is meant to be sort of submissive and pious and really like someone who
A mother.
like in domesticity, right? That the like self-sacrificing caregiver was essentially like written into evolutionary theory. Darwin actually believed that it was like a woman's maternal instinct that made her inferior to men because women were designed to take care of one another and men were designed to compete with one another. And that competition is what gave them higher eminence in their development over time. And so that idea was then carried forward when early psychologists in the early part of the 20th century were writing instinct theory. And these were men, some of whom were really explicitly embracing eugenic ideas. And so they wanted to specifically compel white women to have more babies. And they said they essentially took this idea that women were, that motherhood was all encompassing and that maternal instinct was stronger than anything else, even fear itself. And they like further valorized the idea of that image of a mother, and essentially said, they also said that maternal instinct was stronger than anything else except maybe for a woman's education, because they also said that maternal instinct declined the more educated a person became, and that those races in which
Wow.
maternal instinct was preserved would would win out essentially. So they were saying like the way to be, especially this was a message to white women, the way to be good to serve your family, to serve your country, to serve your race, was to embrace this particular kind of womanhood. And it's really fascinating to look at and to think of like the racial and political landscape today and how much that messaging is still part of it. We talk about birth rates, and we have this like doubling down of on conservative ideas of what a family is and what a woman is, and it has real echoes of the early 20th century.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's just when I was listening to you, it reminded me of this book I read about bell hooks and the comparison she was making with white women in the US that were fighting for having more rights and having the right to go to work. And she was basically saying, but you're fighting to be not protected anymore, because the entire narrative around protecting the women in the US when it came to white women was about protecting them as women, as mothers, staying at home, taking care of their kids. And she was saying, as a Black woman, I'm already in the plantation out there, already working. No one is here protecting me. And I'm fighting for different rights in some ways.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's why it's tricky to talk about the evolution of motherhood as like a whole picture, because it depends who you're talking about, right? So Stephanie Kuntz does a really good job in her work. She's a historian, talking about how for every woman who embraced that true womanhood ideal in the early turn of the 20th century, there were immigrant women who were making her clothes. There were Black women who were working in her home. There were people scrubbing her floors. That white well-off women were able to like embrace that idea because there were other women who were working, which of course we know is also true today when we start to talk about people who are doing domestic work and caregiving work. It's rarely that we exist within that ideal alone.
Yeah. And the other part about the man narrative, like you're mentioning Charles Darwin having all this, it's actually very interesting, because in sexual and reproductive health, one thing that I'm always really disturbed by is that most of the names of the pelvic organ and the uterus out there are named by men as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how a lot of the narratives around that uterus it has been built in many ways by men. So
Is this true for parenting too? A lot of our understanding of child development and the role of mothers in child development has been written by men to such a degree that we really, mothers and parents more broadly, have become invisible in much of that discourse, that we focus on child outcomes. We've learned a lot about an infant's need and a child's need, but we have often done it at the expense of mothers, or while completely ignoring the needs of mothers.
Yeah. And what do you think of, because like I'm really thinking right now of my own experience growing up in being born and raised in Guinea, growing up with a lot of really amazing, phenomenal women, but thinking that many had that kind of sacrificial way of thinking of motherhood or as being a mother. And I would love to get your thoughts on how do you connect, like we were talking about what happens in the brain, right? And everything that like mother brain being rewired when you're pregnant, maybe from the desire of becoming a mother until you go through all this conception and postpartum phase. So how do you explain this sacrificial way of thinking of motherhood when you're parenting?
It's interesting. I think it's an interesting combination of social and biological factors. So, for one thing, we're told that it's sacrificial. You know, there are these deeply embedded stories about maternal sacrifice, but then also there's this um, there's this thread within the parental brain research that you know, we have all of this neural circuitry within us that is that, you know, works to interpret the cues our own body is giving us, and so that we can essentially like read our own emotions and our own needs and then respond to them and like distribute energy accordingly. And those same neural circuits, it's thought that they essentially are extended to include our children once we have them. And so um, that's a really interesting like analogy, I think, when you think about it. So it's like an extension of ourselves to include those needs, and 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 it becomes really hard to not to ignore the needs of our children. You know, our biology is really like compelling us to pay attention to them and to meet them. And so one way to see to feel that or interpret that might be self-sacrifice, right? That it might be like, well, I'm going to prioritize your needs above my own, because our there's a part of the book where I talk about allostasis, which is this like idea that we're are always sort of changing to meet the circumstances around us. And we have this checklist, this like basic biological checklist, like glucose and water and warmth and shelter. And before we have children, like that checklist is all about us. And after we have children, it literally includes all of those things and also now includes those same needs for our children. And so those kind of go to the top of the list. And I think it's easy then for us to like look at the narratives around self-sacrifice and say, oh yeah, that's right, right? Like motherhood is all consuming. And and sometimes those narratives just become really loud, I guess. Like it feels right, and because of these biological changes we're going through, and we see these narratives about maternal instinct all around us, and so it feels like it's describing our experience. And I think the science really is challenging us to just not be quite so reflexive about that, to say like, well, what is it really? Is it a self-sacrifice, or is it in a different sense like a growth of self, right? That we are becoming extended to include this community that of our children and our family, and to serve their needs while we're also serving our own. Like that's just, it's a small difference, but I think it's a really meaningful one.
It is, it is. And it makes me think of mom guilt. It's something that I've been through a lot, even with an invisible child. But for many, like even many friends that I have, like all of my friends that have been mothers have been going through this. My own mom goes through mom guilt a lot. So I always wonder what happens in your brain.
You know, I don't think we have like a specific answer, like what neural mechanisms might be behind mom guilt. I think, in my view, it's actually like a more about a disconnect between our expectations and reality. Like that's where guilt happens, right? So for me, I experienced a lot of guilt in my early postpartum time, because um, because I was full of worry and anxiety, and I really was worried that I worried about the worry itself. I thought that I was already somehow failing my son by not being like overwhelmed by like warmth and certainty and confidence in being his mother. You know, I worried about my capacity to care for him. And um, I think I had that expectation for myself, partly because even if I sort of knew maternal instinct was like a flawed concept, it was still so embedded in my beliefs that I would have some sort of biological change that would like carry me through those hard early weeks, and that I would be transformed into this like maternal creature, and that that transformation wouldn't feel how it felt, which was
Mm.
full of worry and uncertainty. And instead, what I found in the science is that in those early postpartum weeks, the areas of our brain that are highly active are those that are related to motivation and vigilance and meaning making. And that kind of intense preoccupation I felt for my child's well-being is incredibly common and is thought to be linked to that neurobiological change you're going through, because our brains are really like compelling us to pay really close attention to our children at a time
Mm.
when they're also making the threats that we experience or even the imagined threats feel really big. And that's like designed to help us keep our babies alive. Like they need all of our attention and they need us to keep them safe. And it's also about really pushing us into this really intense period of learning how to read our baby's cues and learning what those cues mean, and also learning how to change with our child who is constantly changing day to day. So I think mom guilt is something where like there's a lot to learn about why we experience, but I think it's really that mismatch of the story that we're told of what new motherhood feels like and the um and the reality of it.
Yeah, I can totally, it can resonate because when I went through my stillbirth, actually, I had a lot of mom guilt, and that idea of kind of readjusting your dreams, between reality and expectations. And I think that many women who've been through miscarriages as well can definitely relate, or even mothers who just had, dreams of going back to work, being, in great shape right after, or having energy, and just feeling that the reality you're at right now is just sometimes very dark and very not as you were expecting it to be. So
Yeah.
your brain also can make you think very differently
Yeah.
and play tricks on you.
I think that we have so many narratives around parenthood that are like, if you do X, Y, and Z, then the outcome will be A. Like that is like a sense of like that there are like formulas to follow, whether you're talking about getting pregnant and having a healthy pregnancy, or whether you're talking about attachment and bonding. Like the messages are, these are the steps you need to take. When in reality, like there are so many variables that are often beyond our control.
Yeah.
um and we like miss the opportunity to like take ourselves where we are, like to and um I mean, all of like our failure to talk about miscarriage and stillbirth in like a healthy way. I know this is changing right now, but a lot of that is tied up in maternal instinct and in the desire. I mean, so just a little bit of a tangent. One of my favorite parts of research for this book was finding this essay by Leda Hollingworth from 1916, who was responding. She was a psychologist who was responding to like the writing of maternal instinct into scientific theory. And she said, she called it a cheat device. She said, I see what you're doing here. You're trying to make it look easy. And you're using the same ideas that are used to compel men to go to war to make women like have lots of babies. And she said, like, one of the things you're doing, in addition to kind of glorifying motherhood and limiting our rights under the law, is you're also like hiding the risks of maternal mortality and morbidity and these like really difficult outcomes for women. And you're doing that because you want it to be this thing that we so highly attach such high ideals to, that women really want to do it. I think that like there's some of that in our failure to talk about miscarriage and stillbirth and postpartum depression and the challenges of parenting, diverse kids and all of it, that we want to like we hide, we're afraid to like pop people's bubble, their expectations of what motherhood is. And I think it's really important that we ask ourselves, like, who benefits by not talking about that hard stuff, because it's
Who
not
benefits
you
from
or
not sharing
I.
the stories, right?
Yeah, it's not you and me. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's the people who, um, for whom like those ideals are still important to sustaining social norms that we've outgrown.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's very, it makes me think of this ad of Frida, like this, it's, I think it's an American company that does postpartum stuff.
Yeah.
And you shared about it in your essay with this mom that was going through a postpartum period. And the video on YouTube, I watched it, and I watch all of their videos. It's super raw. You see the blood, you see the milk, you see the the really raw part of maternity. And that video was rejected from the Oscars nomination. Like I think they applied for the Oscars, and they were not selected. And I was just wondering, how ready do you think our societies are to really hear those stories that are very hard stories, and stories of, of life and death as well, of blood,
Yeah.
um
Uh, I think that I think so I think that I think those stories are really necessary right now. I mean, so many of um, the I keep thinking about like here in the United States, we have really high maternal mortality rates, and they're especially very high, like 3 to 4-fold higher for Black women. And I think we need, I feel too often like it's looked at as like a problem that is like so big and so hard, and can we ever solve it? And I think we need these stories to like point to the ways to solve it. Like this is the reality of motherhood, and especially those narratives around women who also face systemic racism and other challenges, that whose needs are most ignored. Uh, we need those stories. Whether we're ready to hear them is a different question. I certainly think there's like a big network of women and parents who are doing the work to say these are the stories we need to tell. Women, and also I think there's a lot of like non-binary and gay families who are doing that work to say we need to be included in this story, in this narrative. And we're ready to tell it, right? Like we know we've felt the consequences of not sharing these stories. And I do think that movement is growing. For sure we're going to get pushback along the way, but I think it's essential. And it, again, we come back to this question of like who benefits from us not telling those stories. And yeah, again, it's not women and families who are facing this transition themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, in France we don't do any ethnical statistics, so we don't know actually. I can't tell you. I know that there's a lot of things that are dysfunctioning in our system, but because we don't count things and we don't name them, it's very hard for us to actually talk about it. Yeah, so when you talk about, it's interesting because when you say about who does it benefit from not sharing the stories, I was just asking myself, if we can't count things and we can't name them, then we can't share the stories. So who benefits from it, right? And
that's interesting. Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah. And when I'm thinking of, in the US, everything that's been happening with Roe v. Wade, what connection would you make between what's been happening with the abortion ban and maternal instinct?
So the way I talk about parenthood in this book is as like that it's a distinct developmental stage that has really intense impacts on our mental and physical health in the short term, but also has these long-term impacts as well. And so I think that like the that fact adds evidence to the idea that no one should be forced into that into those changes. I don't actually think we need this parental brain science to make that case. We already know, we already can say there's a lot of other reasons why someone shouldn't be forced into carrying a pregnancy if it's not their choice. But I think this adds to that. In a different way, it also, Black women and trans people in the US in particular have really, advanced this idea of reproductive justice as like a broader concept that includes access to contraceptive and to abortion, but also includes the right to have the resources you need in order to thrive as a parent or to succeed as a parent. And I think the kind of across that framework, I think the science has a really important role to play in the sense that we can't really talk about what people need to thrive without recognizing the pretty grueling transition that people go through as they become parents, and all of the really powerful adaptation that comes with that, but also the real vulnerabilities that come with it too. And I think the science is really, really important for making those points.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you talk about the reproductive justice movement, and I was thinking of one of my friend who is an amazing supporter of Ninti. Her name is Tsipora, and she launched this podcast called Tant que je serai noire, serai-je mère? So, will I be a mom? I mean, how can I translate that? Is as far as I'm Black, will I be a mom? And basically, the podcast is around the maternity connection with Black mothers, coming from mainly sub-Saharan Africa, but in general, all the biases and the projections we put on Black mothers, you see, I said it, Black women to be mothers.
Yes.
And so she has this podcast and she shares about her choice of not being a mother. And she just brings on board other Black women who are also sharing their choices of when it started and why they chose not to be mothers. And those are really powerful conversations because at least within my community, not being a mother is something that is very heavy, it can be very damaging to your inner identity as well, to your value as a woman.
Yeah.
So having those conversations are so important.
Yeah. So one of my closest friends has decided not to have children, and it's been interesting. She was one of my early readers for this book, and it's been interesting to talk with her about it. And I really think there's a lot of value in the science for people who are making the decision whether or not to have children, and because one thing I talk a lot about is like how can the science be used to really help expectant parents to like take stock of their resources, to like fully know what this transition in life could mean for them, and to like take stock of their social resources and take stock of their like mental health resources. And how do you like build supports around yourself to make it go as well as possible? But those same questions apply, I guess, if you're deciding whether to have children, right? Like to really fully take stock of what it could mean for you and what you might need in order to make it go as healthy as possible. And do you have access to those things societally or individually or within your family or your partnership? And people deserve to have the information to really make those decisions in as best a way as possible. And it goes back to what Leda Hollingworth was writing. She was sort of saying like, you're trying to obscure the complexities of this so that more people will choose to have children. And the same, it blows my mind every time I read it how applicable her essay is, more than 100 years later now. Like, people need all of the information that they can get in order to make the best choices for them.
The best choices, yeah. And it's really all, information is power, knowledge is power. So yeah, I mean, we have a few minutes left. I know that you need to leave sharp in 4 minutes. So so where can we find your book if we want Mother Brain right now? Where can we get it? And what do you want to leave us with, the famous maternal instinct?
So the book can be, you can find it in the United States. You can find it wherever you buy books. There's also a version in Dutch and in the UK. There's also a version there, and there's editions that are coming lots of other countries too, but that aren't out quite yet. And as I mentioned earlier, my website is motherbrainbook.com. And I guess what would I want to leave you with? I mean, I really, again, like love talking about parenthood as like a developmental stage of life. And if we like take it that way, if we really like embrace that truth, then I like to ask like, well, then what would we change? You know, what would we change in terms of clinical care, how we care for pregnant people? What would we change in terms of our social policies? And also, what would we change in terms of like how we talk to one another about what it means to become a parent? And
yeah,
yeah,
we need to share. I love this quote of Michelle Obama. She said, "The worst thing we do to each other as women is to not share our stories."
yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiona. Wonderful conversation, she said.
Oh,
okay, thank you. I know you have to leave, Chelsea.
yeah.
So thank you so much. And you can find the live on Instagram, and we will also put it on our website, nintyhealth.com. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.